On April 27th, the U.S. Senate unanimously issued a letter to the Secretary General of the United Nations. Now, it's unusual for the United States Senate to unanimously agree on much of anything, as I think people are well aware, but on this matter, literally every United States senator, from Ted Cruz and Tom Cotton to Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, were in harmony. And they all signed a letter condemning the United Nations for attempting to advance, quote, an anti-Israel agenda. And the senators, the signatories to this letter, complain that the United Nations actions at times, so presumably in recent history, have, quote, reinforced the broader scourge of anti-Semitism. So that is something that the entirety of the United States Senate agrees upon, and that they are in accord with one another in regard to. So let's just dig into some of the claims here. The impetus for the letter, which was circulated initially by Marco Rubio, obviously a Republican from Florida, and Chris Coons, a Democrat from Delaware, is to affirm the Senate's support for the recent statements made by Nikki Haley, who is the UN ambassador under Trump. Nikki Haley, in the words of is commended for saying, quote, it is the UN's anti-Israel bias that is long overdue for change. Now, what is the long-standing anti-Israel bias that the UN exhibits, allegedly? What does it consist of? Well, in December of last year, there was a resolution that was passed in the United Nations, because the U.S. abstained, and that was the first resolution of its kind since 2002. So if you're going to contend that the UN is inordinately fixated on Israel, you'd have to consider why only in the last 15 or so years have a grand total of two major resolutions been authorized or passed. And, the fact that all 100 senators signed on to this is really important in terms of public relations for the Israeli government. The Israeli PM account tweeted out on April 28th that he thanks all 100 U.S. senators for standing up for Israel at the UN. So, that's ostensibly the account of Netanyahu. And if he can say, that this is an issue that crosses partisan divides, it unites people of ostensibly different political outlooks, that actually gives some level of legitimacy to the claims made by Israel that they are unduly penalized by international organizations. And the fact that Bernie Sanders, for example, signed on to this letter, I don't think should come as much of a surprise. Although during the 2016 Democratic primary campaign, he did at least make some statements that were against the grain with respect to American policy vis-a-vis Israel and Palestine, and there were some advancements that he definitely made in that area. He's always been relatively tentative on this subject, and usually not willing to buck consensus in such a dramatic manner as to rebuff requests to get him to sign on to this letter. Though if he had signed on to it, or if any senator had signed on to it, it would have been symbolically important, because it would have demonstrated that no, there was not unanimity in the American government's highest legislative chamber on this subject. One thing that the letter also does is it lauds Erin Barclay, another Trump official. She's a deputy assistant secretary of state under Trump, who denounced the UN Human Rights Council for, quote, having an obsession with Israel, which is the largest threat to the council's credibility. It limits the good we can accomplish by making a mockery of this council. One thing I've tended to notice in just argumentation on the internet and elsewhere in general, so it's not necessarily related to Israel or Palestine, is that when people want to delegitimize your argument, what they'll tend to do is say, "Oh, you are obsessed with this. You fixate on this issue at the expense of others which demand your attention." And what that rebuttal does is it makes it so that the person claiming you're obsessed doesn't actually have to reply on the merits to the argumentation that you're advancing. So this is just kind of one big example of that. I don't think anybody argues that, for example, Syria right now isn't a major human rights concern. I mean, anybody with a brain would acknowledge that, but nevertheless, Israel-Palestine is a very living issue, and we are approaching the 50-year anniversary of the occupation, which should, I think, provoke everyone's notice. So I think people should be aware that this letter was issued and that everybody signed on to it, including Bernie Sanders, even Rand Paul, who has voiced some unorthodox views with regard to Israel. Is this total conformity something that we want the United States government to be projecting, or is there maybe room for nuance? It also goes to, this letter also really does a excellent job at conflating anti-Israel criticism or criticism of the Israeli government with anti-Semitism by saying that just by allowing the UN to continue in its supposed fixation on Israel, that alone enables anti-Semitism. So they don't explicitly assert that anti-Israel criticism and anti-Semitism are one and the same, but they're linking the two and saying that that the way to counteract anti-Semitism is to counteract these supposed biases that are running rampant in the United Nations. So that's all I have to say about that for now. Read the letter for yourself. You can see if Bernie Sanders' rationale you find compelling. And that is it for now. Have a good day.